Today we are going to be making this delicious loaf of French bread in the bread machine. It has a beautiful texture, a beautiful crust. It's nice and soft on the inside and it's crusty on the outside, and I'm going to show you how to do it from start to finish in the bread machine. Hello friends, and welcome to Butterfly Meadows Homestead. I'm Dorinda. Now there's a couple of ways that you could do this. You could let the bread machine mix and rise the dough and then shape the dough into a traditional French loaf and finish baking it in the oven. If you're really after that shape, that's what you'll have to do. But I'm just going to show us today how to bake it from start to finish in the bread machine. And before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about French bread. So I've been really digging and trying to find out everything I can about French bread. Is it really French or is it American? And from what I can tell, it is French. But what mostly makes French bread is the shape of the bread. You know, the torpedo shape that French bread comes in. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of difference in French bread and any other bread you would make, other than it is a very simple bread. Traditionally, French bread only contains flour, water, salt, and yeast, and that's it. But in our recipe, we are going to add a couple of ingredients because we are using the bread machine. Now I'm going to be using my KBS Bread Machine, and I went ahead and found in the KBS recipe book that came with my machine, this is what it looks like on the front, French bread recipe. Now I don't use recipes out of this book just as they are in the book, mostly because every single recipe in this book calls to add gluten. And although I do add gluten sometimes when I'm making bread, I don't want to add gluten to every single bread that I make. And even this French bread recipe calls for gluten. But I compared many different French bread recipes. And of course, all of them had the flour, water, salt, and yeast. And then some of them added all kinds of other ingredients, just like a regular white bread would have. And I thought, well, I don't want an enriched bread, which is what a lot of those recipes were, just baked on the French cycle. I wanted as authentic as I could get French bread, even though it's not going to be in the traditional torpedo shape. So I compared those recipes to the recipe in this little booklet. This recipe in this book was as close to the recipe I had decided to use as any other, except for the gluten. I don't know why they insist on adding gluten to every recipe. I think that is to try to have a better outcome in the bread machine. Perhaps they think, you know, people may be using an inferior flour, therefore they need to add the gluten so that they get a better outcome and it doesn't reflect poorly on the machine. That's just my theory on the KBS bread machine. But I don't add gluten and I get perfect results, so I left that out. But this is a 1.5 pound loaf, and the extra ingredients that we're going to be adding, so traditionally it would be flour, water, salt, and yeast. But we are going to add 2 teaspoons, that's not a lot, 2 teaspoons of sugar, and we're also going to be adding 2 egg whites. And I'll tell you why we're going to do this. Because we also don't have as much yeast as you would in a regular white bread. So my regular white bread recipe calls for 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. And this is just 2 teaspoons of yeast. And all of the French bread recipes that I looked at called for lower amounts of yeast. I don't know why that is, unless it is a flavor. It has to be a flavor thing to keep you from getting that traditional yeasty bread flavor, is all I could figure out. But the sugar is added for 2 reasons. And yes, I already know the yeast feeds from the flour. As it breaks down the flour, that's where it really gets its food. But when you add sugar to a dough, the yeast will also feed from that sugar. So since we have less yeast, we're going to add some sugar to give it a little extra food to help it along, because we are using a bread machine, and I can't just, watch it. If I were doing it manually, I could watch it and know when it had risen enough. I'm using a bread machine. Everything has set times in the bread machine, so I'm going to add the sugar to give my yeast a little extra food to help it rise more quickly. The second reason for the sugar is to help your crust be more crusty, because when sugar is added to a bread dough, it will help the crust be more brown, and you just have a crispier crust. Which brings me to the egg white. Now, normally I only add eggs to an enriched bread, and I'm planning on doing a video on an enriched white bread, which is our absolute favorite that I make. It's absolutely delicious and soft, and it's just wonderful. But in it, I use I use egg yolks. But in this recipe, we're adding egg whites, and I'll tell you the reason we want to add the egg whites. It is to give our crust a crispier crust, because French bread is supposed to be very crispy on the outside and very soft on the inside. And because I'm using the bread machine, I'm going to add the egg whites to my mixture. If I were making French bread manually, what I would do is, after I had it all shaped and formed and rolled up and scored, then I would brush it with an egg wash. But because I can't do that in the bread machine, I'm just going to add egg whites to the recipe. Another thing, French bread that you buy in the store, if you will notice it has the little bumpy, is what I call it, feel on the bottom. It has this texture on the bottom, and the way they achieve that, it is simply the pan they bake it in has little holes in it. It's shaped kind of half moon shaped, and it has these little holes. That is to give the French bread that texture, and they're just after that crispy. They're trying to get that crispy crust, which really I don't understand, because once they bag it up and put it out for sale, it's not crispy at all. That brings me to another point I want to make is, so let's say you've made your French bread in the bread machine, it turned out wonderful and you loved it. Something about French bread you need to know: it is meant to be eaten fresh. It is not a bread that you make to keep 2-3 days or however long you might keep it. But if you're like me and have a small family, you can't eat an entire loaf of French bread at one setting. So there is a way around that. So you go ahead and you make your French bread. You don't eat it all that first day. Well, the next day or two that you want to eat it, all you have to do is put it in the oven. And what I would do is, don't slice more than you're going to eat. And so put it in the oven and put the open end of the bread that you have sliced face down on your pan. Pop it in a preheated oven of like 350 for 5 or 10 minutes, if it takes that long, just to heat the bread back up and crisp up the outer crust. And it will be fresh just like it came out of the machine. And that's a way to keep your bread fresh. And you can do that with any kind of homemade bread. But especially you're going to want to do it with your French bread, because it is meant to eat fresh. And if you want that crispy crunch day after day, that's what you're going to have to do, is you're going to have to freshen it up in the oven. So now we're going to get on to how to make the bread. In whatever bread machine you have, I have the KBS Bread Machine, but you don't have to have a KBS Bread Machine. You can use any kind of bread machine. So get your pan, make sure your paddle is in place. And you're going to want 1 cup of warm water. Now remember, we don't have a lot of time in the bread machine. So if you use cold water, that is going to really slow down how fast your bread rises. So you want to use warm water so that it keeps everything nice and warm and kind of jump starts the process. So 1 cup of water, and we want to add, this is 1 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. So that's actually a little more salt than is in a regular white loaf. And then here I have 2 teaspoons of sugar. And yes, you can use honey if you want to use honey, but I'm just using regular white sugar. And I'm putting all of that in there. And then I also have my egg whites that I am going to add right here into my water. I'm not going to add the yeast yet. I'm going to put that on top of my flour. So now we want 3 cups of bread flour. Now I know I'm going to get questions, can I use all-purpose flour? That is completely up to you. The reason I use bread flour is because of the protein level in the bread flour. This ensures you get a good rise and that your bread doesn't sink in the middle, and it just makes a better bread. If you want to try it with all-purpose flour, just go right ahead, and you will get bread. It will be good bread, but it might not hold its rise as good as a bread flour did, or rise up as much as a bread flour did. And I didn't go into detail here, but you sprinkle your flour on top of that liquid mixture to kind of make a floating bed of flour. And then I'm just going to put my yeast in. You don't have to make a well or do anything special, just put it on top. And now we are going to put our pan into our bread machine. I'm going to bring the camera down so you can see as I put it in. Hopefully you have a better view of what's going on here in the bread machine. So you just want to lock your pan into your machine. They all work a little bit different, so just lock your pan in. And my machine has a setting for French, which is setting number 4. Now I looked at the book that came with my machine to see what was the difference between the French bread setting and the soft white bread setting, and it is so minimal. I mean, so minimal. If you do not have a French bread setting on your bread machine and you just have white bread, soft white bread setting, go ahead and use that, because it is not enough difference to make a difference in the outcome of your bread. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to use setting number 4, which is French bread, and I am using 1.5 pound loaf size, and I'm going to go with a medium crust. Normally on my white bread, I would sometimes use the light crust, but since this is French bread, I'm going to go ahead and go with the medium crust on my machine. That is 3 hours and 19 minutes. And so we're going to hit start. And I always say, go ahead and open up your pan and look and see if you need to add any liquid or perhaps flour. So let that mix for a few minutes and make sure it forms a good ball. Now I'm very happy with how that dough ball looks, so we're just going to close the lid and let the bread machine do its thing, and we will bring you back when it's done. It's that time. I'm just waiting for the beep, beep, beep to get the bread out of the machine. One of my favorite parts of making bread in the bread machine is taking out that fresh loaf and smelling it and seeing how wonderful it turned out. It should be beeping any moment now. There it is. Okay. And just a little something, I don't think I've ever mentioned this before, but most bread makers do a keep warm cycle after the bread finishes. So if you don't want it to continue to heat, be sure you hold that button and turn it all the way off or unplug it, because that just wastes electricity if your bread is not in there. Okay, so here's our loaf. It looks pretty good. Now I did not take the paddle out, so I am going to have a hole, and actually the paddle is stuck up in the bread. It is a very crispy, hopefully you can hear that. It's a very crispy loaf. I do need to get that paddle out. I'll have to get something. Okay, I know the machine came with this little hook to pull this out, but and I'll just show you how I do this in case this ever happens to you. So I know the paddle has the hole, and then there'll be a straight line somewhere. So I kind of, and it's hard to do on this loaf because it's so crispy, but I try to find where that, which way the paddle is pointed, so I can get it out. Rarely have this happen, and I know it's because the crust is just so, okay, so here I found where the paddle was pointing, so I'm just going to tear the bread right there to give it a pathway out. Now, it will be very hot, so you don't want to grab it with your bare fingers. Now, that left quite a hole, but I was busy and I did not take the paddle out. Now, this is very crispy. I am going to let it sit here and cool for about 20 or 30 minutes. Then we will come back and cut into it. It smells really good. Okay, so our bread is cooled. It's just barely warm. And we're gonna put it on our cutting board. And for this loaf, I am not going to use my bread slicer because I want the slices to be thicker than for sandwiches. So I'll try to do this so you can see. Let's just cut into it. And I'm using a serrated knife. Oh, it looks really nice. I'm going to cut a second slice here. My slicing is not even, but that's okay. So hopefully you can see the crumb here. It's got a very nice crumb, a very good texture. It bounces back when you squeeze it. It smells so good. So I am very happy with this. The egg white definitely gave it a crispy texture on crust on the outside, and it's moist and has a good soft, very soft crumb on the inside. So here is a delicious loaf of French bread made completely in the bread machine. So I hope you'll give this recipe a try. Thanks for stopping by. God bless.